There is a particular silence that settles over a room right before someone you love decides to ruin you politely, and Wendy Thompson had learned to recognize it the way other people recognize the smell of rain before a storm, a pressure change in the air, a stillness that has weight. She felt it the moment she stepped into her mother's kitchen on a gray Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks before her sister's wedding, and found Diane Thompson and Brooke seated shoulder to shoulder on one side of the table like a tribunal that had already reached its verdict and was only waiting for the accused to arrive so they could read it aloud. No one offered her coffee. That, more than anything, told her what kind of meeting this was going to be. In the Thompson household, coffee was currency, a small offering that meant sit, stay, we're glad you're here. Its absence was its own sentence, delivered before anyone had opened their mouth. Diane let the quiet stretch a beat too long, the way a woman does when she has rehearsed a line enough times that she wants to enjoy the performance. Then the smile arrived, slow, satisfied, the kind of smirk that takes practice in a mirror before it's ready for an audience. We all agreed, she said. You're not welcome at the wedding. Wendy waited for the rest of it, the way you wait for a second shoe to drop, or a punchline that never comes. There wasn't one. Her mother simply let the sentence sit there on the table between the ribbon samples and the binder full of seating charts, fully dressed and pleased with itself. It's not personal, sweetheart, Diane went on, clearly enjoying the sound of her own generosity. You make everything about money. Spreadsheets, receipts, questions. Austin's family is refined, and we can't have that energy around them. Everyone agreed. It's for the best. Everyone. The word did a slow lap around the inside of Wendy's skull. Cousins, aunts, bridesmaids, an entire jury she had personally financed, voting her off an island she had built plank by plank with her own checking account. She looked at Brooke. Her sister, whose dress was paid for. Whose honeymoon was sitting, at that exact moment, in a savings account Wendy had opened in her own name so it would earn interest until the day she handed it over as a gift. Brooke was staring at the salt shaker like it might, if studied hard enough, offer an alibi. Her thumbnail dug little crescents into the edge of a binder. She did not say a word. And here is the strange thing, the detail Wendy would return to later, turning it over like a coin with a flaw in the mint, underneath her mother's triumph, just visible if you knew where to look, was relief. The specific relief of a woman who has just moved something breakable out of reach before it could be knocked over and shattered in front of company. Wendy stood, tucked the folder she'd brought. She'd assumed wedding details meant money, because in this family it always meant money, under her arm, and said the only 2 words she had left in her. Good to know. Then she walked to her car while her hands were still steady, and drove the 15 quiet minutes home with the radio off, hands at 10 and 2, thinking in lists, because lists were what she had instead of screaming. To understand why a woman could hear her own mother banish her from a wedding and respond with 3 syllables instead of a scene, you have to understand what Wendy Thompson actually was, underneath the tidy blazers and the appointment book full of other people's tax anxieties. She was 36. She owned a small accounting practice on Main Street in Millhaven, Ohio, 2 employees, a coffee maker older than both of them combined, and a hand-painted sign her father had helped her hang 7 years earlier, back when the whole operation was one rented room and a fax machine that hated her. Nobody had handed her any of it. She'd worked the overnight shift at a freight warehouse through college, keying numbers into a terminal until 2 in the morning, passed the CPA exam on her second attempt, put in 6 tax seasons at somebody else's firm before she trusted herself enough to open her own door. People assume accountants are boring. Maybe they are. But boring people have habits, and habits, Wendy had come to believe, are a kind of armor nobody thinks to shoot at. She bought only refundable airfare. She kept every receipt in a labeled folder, the label itself labeled. She pulled her own credit report on a fixed schedule, the way other people book dental cleanings, a small, unglamorous maintenance ritual that most people find tedious right up until the week it saves their life. She read every contract to the signature line. Even the gym membership. Her office manager liked to joke that Wendy had never once raised her voice in the 7 years they'd worked together, and she was nearly right. Wendy didn't raise her voice. she raised documentation. In the Thompson family, this made her exactly two things: the one you called when a bill looked wrong, and the one you called when you simply needed money and preferred not to examine why. Those two calls always started the same way: soft, sugared, a casserole left on the porch of her conscience, and they always ended the same way too, with her card number, her checkbook, her name on a line she probably shouldn't have signed but always did. For 5 years, her name had been the most borrowed object in the family. She just hadn't understood yet how literally that borrowing would eventually be taken. 5 years earlier, her father, Frank Thompson, had died of heart failure at 58, a parts inspector who'd worked the same plant floor for 3 decades, a man who counted everything twice and complained about nothing, ever, not once, not even at the end. On his last night in the hospital, machines murmuring around him like a room full of polite spectators, he'd held Wendy's hand and said 4 words: "Keep them steady, Wendy." A dying man's last request becomes a contract if you are built the way Wendy was built. She'd signed it in her head before the machines went quiet, and she had honored it with the terrible thoroughness of someone who reads contracts to the signature line. Her mother was 56 at the time and had never in her adult life paid a bill on her own. The life insurance turned out to be smaller than Diane had assumed, and that discovery moved through her in stages: first fear, then bitterness, then something closer to creativity. The first call came 4 months after the funeral. She was behind on the mortgage. "Family helps family," Diane said, and Wendy drove over with her checkbook because her mother said it, and the words felt, in that moment, entirely true. Then it was Brooke's car and a dead transmission. Family helps family. Then Brooke's last semester of tuition, because your father would have wanted it. Then the furnace. The roof deductible. A dental crown. A surprise balance on a Visa card her mother swore, with her hand over her heart, she did not remember opening. Wendy never said no. She told herself she was keeping them steady, the way her father had asked. Somewhere in her office there was a spreadsheet with a name she had never once said out loud to another living person. It tracked every transfer, every date, every stated purpose, because accountants cannot help themselves, even, especially, when the numbers belong to people they love. People sometimes ask how much she gave her family over those 5 years. She knows the figure down to the penny. She isn't ready to say it yet. It's large enough that she wants you to hear it the way she finally heard it herself. At the precise moment she understood exactly what her mother and sister had been quietly building with her money, and with something of hers worth considerably more than money. Last spring, Brooke got engaged. She was 28, 7 years younger than Wendy, and had been dating Austin Whitfield for 2 years. Austin was, by every honest account, a genuinely decent man, 30 years old, an engineer, polite to waitresses, the sort of person who remembers the name of your dog after meeting it once. His family was old Charleston money, the settled and unhurried kind that doesn't need to announce itself: a house with a name, a church pew that might as well have had a brass plaque. Naturally, the wedding would be in Charleston. Brooke announced the engagement over dinner at their mother's house, and Wendy, she wants this on the record, was happy for her. She hugged her sister and meant every second of it. They hadn't been close in years. Brooke had always found Wendy's life a little dull and had never been shy about saying so. But she was glowing, and Wendy let herself enjoy the glow, right up until dessert. That's when Diane set down her fork, turned to Wendy in front of the whole table, and said, "You'll help." Not a question. An announcement, delivered the way you announce the weather. Brooke slid her phone across the tablecloth to show off a venue by the harbor: white columns, live oaks trailing moss, the kind of setting built for a photograph rather than a marriage. It was, Wendy noted with the part of her brain that never fully clocks out, already booked. The confirmation email sat right there on the screen, dated 10 days earlier, with a deposit listed as past due. Her sister had reserved a wedding she could not pay for before asking the one person who was expected to pay for it. Wendy looked at the overdue notice. Then at her mother's expectant, sugar-glazed smile. "We'll talk numbers tomorrow," she said, and the whole table relaxed and laughed and passed the pie, because the bank had just quietly approved the loan. She did not know it yet, but that was the last wedding decision anyone would ever consult her on. Here is the thing people consistently got wrong about Wendy. Yes, she opened her wallet. But she opened it the way an accountant opens anything, with a paper trail attached, out of instinct rather than suspicion. That single habit is the entire reason this story ends the way it does. She paid the venue deposit directly, on her own card, with an emailed receipt landing in her inbox within the hour. She paid for the dress the same way, and stood at the boutique watching Brooke spin in front of a mirror, crying, and for one unguarded minute it felt like they were sisters again in the old, uncomplicated sense. She covered the caterer's first installment, the florist's retainer, half the photographer. For the honeymoon, she did something specific, a detail worth remembering, because everything that follows hinges on it. She opened a brand new savings account at her own bank, under her own name only, and labeled it Brooke Honeymoon. $6,500 went into it, meant to be handed over as a gift after the ceremony. Until that day arrived, it was hers, her account, her money, sitting exactly where she could see it. And for her mother, she booked round-trip flights from Columbus to Charleston, fully refundable, because Wendy Thompson had never in her adult life purchased a non-refundable ticket of any kind. Every receipt went into a folder. Every payment landed on a spreadsheet she privately called the wedding ledger. Her office manager watched her updating it one evening, one eyebrow raised. "It's a wedding," she said, "not an audit." "In my family," Wendy told her, and meant it, everything is eventually an audit. She wants to be clear that none of this felt like suspicion at the time. It felt like muscle memory, the same reflex that made her check the batteries in her smoke detectors twice a year. Watching Brooke twirl in that dress, she thought of her father, and keeping them steady felt, for a while, like keeping him. The paper trail wasn't distressed. It was simply how she moved through the world. But muscle memory is a strange thing. It keeps working quietly in the background, right up until the exact day it saves your life. The damage started the way most water damage starts, as a faint stain on the ceiling, easy to dismiss, easy to explain away. In June, Brooke and Diane and 4 bridesmaids spent a Saturday floating between bridal salons, trying on gowns, drinking champagne out of plastic flutes, posting photos with captions full of exclamation points. Wendy found out from the photos. When she mentioned it, Brooke laughed lightly and said, "Oh, that was just bridal party stuff. You'd have been bored." Wendy had paid for the dress they were toasting to. In July, there was an engagement dinner at a steakhouse for Austin's parents, flown up from Charleston to meet the family properly. Wendy learned about it 3 days after it happened. Her mother's explanation was that the table only sat 10. "It was just immediate people," she said. Wendy is, for the record, the bride's only sibling. Then came the group chat. Every wedding has one, the central nervous system where the schedule, the vendors, the running jokes, and the payment reminders all live. Her cousin Megan, a bridesmaid, texted in August asking why Wendy hadn't weighed in on a question. Wendy told her she wasn't in any chat. A long pause followed, 3 dots appearing and vanishing, the visual equivalent of someone deciding whether or not to hand you something heavy. "That's weird," Megan finally wrote. "Literally everything is in there." Wendy sat with the phone in her hand for a while afterward. She would like to tell you she confronted someone that same night. She didn't. She did what over-responsible daughters do best, she manufactured an explanation sturdy enough to carry the weight. "They're disorganized. It's an oversight. Brooke's overwhelmed. She had invoices of her own to send." It was easier, in the moment, to believe in oversight than in strategy. But somewhere behind her sternum, a small, cold, professional part of her brain, the part that reads contracts all the way to the signature line, quietly opened a file on her own family and did not close it again. "Literally everything is in there," Megan had said, with no idea how right she was. Months before any of those small slights had accumulated into a pattern, something else had already happened, something that matters enormously later, so hold on to it. During one of her scheduled credit checkups, Wendy found a hard inquiry she didn't recognize. Ashford Community Credit Union, Millhaven. She had no accounts there, had never set foot inside the building. She called that same morning, sat on hold through 2 transfers, and finally reached a representative who confirmed the inquiry was tied to an application with a signature already on file. "It's showing as authorized, ma'am," the woman said. She couldn't discuss specifics over the phone, anything further would require a written request, and written responses could take up to 30 days. Wendy hung up and did everything a careful person can reasonably do. She filed a formal dispute with the credit bureau that same afternoon. Another 30-day clock started. She placed a fraud alert on her file. She wrote down the date, the representative's name, and her exact wording in the notebook she kept for phone calls, a habit left over from tax season. Then, before she could even bring it up over Sunday dinner, her mother beat her to it. "Oh, did some credit thing call you?" Diane asked, waving a serving spoon like a conductor's baton. "The venue does a payment verification on everyone whose name is attached to wedding expenses. Austin's mother had one too. Charleston people, so formal about everything." It was specific. It was casual. It arrived exactly on schedule, like a train someone else had built the timetable for. The dispute crawled through its full 30 days and returned marked verified, signature on file. Wendy remembers thinking, "Fine," a paperwork echo from the venue, and closing the folder in her mind. She had checked, called, disputed, flagged, and documented. She had done every single thing right. That's the part that still tightens something in her jaw. She'd done everything right, and it still hadn't been enough, because the person who'd scheduled that train had spent 5 years studying exactly how she thinks. The bridal shower landed in September, on a garden patio Wendy paid for down to the room fee and a ridiculous tiered tower of macarons she never got to taste. She knew what everything cost because the invoices all came to her. What didn't come to her was credit. The thank you cards, printed on thick cream stock, read, "Hosted with love, Diane Thompson." Her mother spent the whole afternoon accepting compliments on the menu like a monarch accepting flowers, while Wendy stood near the gift table refilling coffee cups and telling herself, unconvincingly, that it didn't matter. Then Megan found her by the dessert table and pulled her, gently, by the elbow, into the hallway near the restrooms. Megan was 33, Wendy's father's brother's daughter, and the only relative who ever called simply to talk rather than to ask for something. She had the specific look of a person who has decided, against her own comfort, to say the hard thing out loud. "I heard Brooke earlier," she said. "One of the bridesmaids asked why you weren't in any of the photos." She stopped. Wendy told her to finish it. Brooke said, "Wendy's help, not bridal party." The hallway smelled like coffee and hand soap. Wendy studied the wallpaper seam so her face would have something else to do. Help. Not sister. Not family. A service you order and pay a fee for. Through the doorway she could see Aunt Carol, her father's younger sister, 58, sharp as a filed edge, watching Diane work the room. Carol caught her eye, crossed the room, and squeezed Wendy's arm without asking what was wrong, which is how you know someone has actually been paying attention all along. "Your father kept books, too, honey," Carol said quietly. "He always said numbers don't lie. People do." Then she went back to her table. Wendy drove home that evening with the radio off, doing the one kind of math she'd spent 5 years carefully avoiding, the kind where you finally total up what you're actually getting back. The following Tuesday, after work, she drove the 15 minutes to her mother's house to ask one plain question. Brooke's car was already in the driveway. The two of them were at the kitchen table with binders and ribbon samples spread out like a crime scene of stationery. The room went quiet the specific way a conversation goes quiet when it's switching tracks mid-sentence. Wendy didn't sit down. She'd paid, she said, for the venue, the dress, the caterer, the florist, half the photographer, and the shower. She was currently holding the honeymoon money in a savings account and her mother's flights on her own card. So, why wasn't she in the group chat? Why not at the dinner, not in a single photo? Why did the shower cards say hosted by Diane Thompson? She kept her voice level the entire time. It's the only voice she has. Her mother's eyes went glossy on cue, one hand rising to touch the small gold cross she wears for exactly these occasions. "After everything this family has been through," Diane said, "you stand in my kitchen counting pennies. Your father would be ashamed." Brooke studied her phone as though the answer might load there if she waited long enough. Nobody addressed the actual question. That's what struck Wendy most, standing in that kitchen. The question simply sat there among the ribbon samples, and both of them stepped carefully around it, the way you step around a stain on the carpet you'd rather not discuss. Her mother pivoted smoothly into a monologue about stress, blood pressure, and the way weddings apparently bring out selfishness in certain people. Wendy said goodnight and drove home. No slammed door, she isn't built that way. She made tea, sat at her own kitchen table, and told herself she'd get a straight answer eventually. She was right about that. 3 days later, they gave her one, all at once, in a single rehearsed, smiling ambush. Which brings the story back to where it started, the Sunday kitchen table, the folded hands, the missing coffee, the smirk her mother had clearly been rehearsing for days. We all agreed. "You're not welcome at the wedding." Wendy had absorbed it, walked to her car, and driven home with her hands steady on the wheel. At her own kitchen table that night, laptop open, she did 4 things, in order, the way she does everything. First, she logged into the savings account labeled Brooke Honeymoon and transferred the $6,500 back into her checking account. It moved instantly. Her money, her account, a gift for family, and she had just been formally informed she no longer qualified as family. Second, she pulled up the airline confirmation and cancelled her mother's round-trip flights to Charleston, fully refundable as always. The refund notice landed in her inbox with a soft little chime she can only describe, without apology, as delicious. Third, she emailed the florist and the DJ, whose final installments were scheduled to hit her card the following week, and informed them, politely and in writing, that she would no longer be the payer going forward and that they should contact the bride directly for the remaining balance. She cancelled nothing already paid for. She took back only what was hers and stopped only what hadn't happened yet. An accountant to the very end. Fourth, she closed the wedding ledger spreadsheet, typed the final line, and let her hand hover over the keyboard for 1 full second, 5 years of habit asking, one last time, if she was sure. Then she hit save. At 9 o'clock she silenced her phone, the way she does every night during tax season, and went to bed. She slept better than she had in months, which told her something she wasn't quite ready to admit yet. While she slept, her phone lit up on the dresser, over and over, in the dark. 23 times. She woke at 6 to a screen full of missed calls, 14 from her mother, 8 from Brooke, 1 from an unfamiliar South Carolina number. The voicemails told their own little opera in 3 acts. The early ones were syrup. "Sweetheart, there's been a misunderstanding. Call me back. Love you." The middle ones clipped and impatient. "Wendy, this is childish. Fix the tickets." The final ones, recorded close to midnight, dropped the mask entirely, her mother's voice low and furious. "You ungrateful little, you have no idea what you've just done. You are going to put that money back, or so help me." Wendy stood in her kitchen in her robe and listened to that last message twice. Not for the insult, for the phrasing. "You have no idea what you've just done." That isn't what you say to someone who cancelled a few plane tickets. That's what you say to someone who has just pulled a thread they weren't supposed to find. She was still holding her coffee when the text arrived at 6:42 a.m. from her cousin Megan. First a photograph, slightly angled, taken quickly, of a document lying on a desk. Then the message beneath it, "Wendy, a file crossed my desk at work as part of a routine verification. I could lose my job for sending this, so please don't share it. But you're my family too. Is this your signature? Did you really co-sign Brooke's wedding loan at Ashford? Because if you didn't, you need to call me right now." Wendy zoomed in on the photo, and her kitchen went very, very still. It was a loan signature page. Ashford Community Credit Union. Borrower, Brooke Ellen Thompson. Co-signer, in handwriting that curled exactly the way her own once curled, Wendy J. Thompson. She had never once set foot inside that credit union in her life. She called Megan before her coffee had a chance to cool. Megan talked fast and quiet from her car in the parking lot of the bank where she worked as a loan processor, a different institution across the county, which is the only reason the file had crossed her desk at all. Verification paperwork on the Ashford loan had landed in front of her, she'd seen Wendy's name, and her stomach had gone straight through the floor. "Pull your reports," Megan said. "All 3 bureaus. Today." Wendy did it before 9, office door shut, running her own case the way she'd run a client's fraud file 100 times before. And there it was, sitting in her credit history like a cuckoo's egg dropped in someone else's nest. A loan from Ashford Community Credit Union, opened in March, filed under Special Events Financing, $14,000. Primary borrower, Brooke. Co-signer, Wendy. Every payment so far had been small, automatic, minimum, just enough to keep the account quiet and unremarkable. Underneath it, a second egg she hadn't even been looking for, a store credit card from Everly Bridal Outlet, opened the same month, in Wendy's name alone, carrying a balance just under $3,000. Gowns. Alterations. Shoes. A veil. She sat back in her chair and stared at the opening dates, and a cold, orderly kind of anger began filing itself neatly into drawers inside her head. The hard inquiry from the spring. The 30-day dispute that had come back verified, signature on file. Her mother's breezy little speech about the venue's payment verification process. There had never been any verification at all. There had been a fraudulent application quietly moving through the financial system with her name stapled to it, while her own mother stood in her own kitchen, serving spoon in hand, and lied straight to her face. The loan had been signed on March 14. Wendy opened her calendar to see exactly where she'd been that day. When she saw it, she laughed out loud, alone in her office. Here is what makes forgery such a foolish crime to attempt against an accountant: they can always prove where they were, because somebody, somewhere, has already built the paper trail for them. That same morning she sent Ashford Community Credit Union a written demand for a full copy of the application file. When your name is attached to a loan, you're legally entitled to see it. Once the words identity theft and law enforcement enter a letter, small-town credit unions tend to move with impressive speed. Megan, from long experience, coached her on the exact phrasing that lenders can't afford to ignore. 2 days later, a thick envelope landed in Wendy's hands, and she spread the pages across her kitchen table like a detective's crime board. There was the application, filled out in Brooke's rounded handwriting. There was Wendy's forged signature, appearing 3 separate times, each one a careful, patient copy of the way she used to sign her name a full decade earlier. There was the proof of identity, a photocopy of her old, expired driver's license, the one that had spent 5 years sitting quietly in a fireproof box in her mother's hall closet, stored there the same month her father died, when Wendy had moved into her own place and hadn't gotten around to relocating it. Only one person on earth had regular access to that closet. She sat very still for a moment. Then she opened her calendar and her email and built out the other half of the board. March 14, the day all 3 signatures were supposedly witnessed in person at a Millhaven branch. She had been at the Ohio CPA Spring Conference in Columbus, 2 hours away. Her badge had scanned into sessions at 8:15, 10:30, and 2 o'clock. A hotel folio carried her name, checked in the night before, checked out the morning after. A lunch receipt, time-stamped, from the hotel restaurant. She laid the badge report beside the forged signature page and, for the first time in 5 years, felt the ground beneath her family shift a few inches toward her side of the table. They had her name. She had the paper. What she needed now was a lawyer. And it happened that she did the books for a very good one. Patricia Hale was 54, family law and civil litigation, a corner office above the pharmacy downtown, a client of Wendy's firm for 9 years. Wendy called, Patricia saw her that same afternoon. She laid the pages out on Patricia's conference table in order, the same way she'd want a client to present them for her. Patricia read for a long time in silence, glasses down her nose, turning each page with one finger like it might be sticky. Finally she set the glasses on the table. "Wendy, I want you to hear the words before we go any further. This is forgery. This is identity theft. In Ohio, those are felonies." She let the sentence sit, then laid out the map, clean and cold, and Wendy found she loved her for the coldness of it. Option 1, sign a fraud affidavit with the credit union, swearing under oath the signatures weren't hers. The lender would be obligated to investigate, freeze the remaining funds, and, very likely, refer the matter to the police. Option 2, file a police report herself directly, which would strengthen the case and open a criminal file with a case number attached. Option 3, the one families almost always choose, Patricia said, watching Wendy's face carefully, was to quietly pay it off, say nothing, and keep the peace intact. Wendy asked what happened if she did nothing at all. Patricia folded her hands. "Then in the eyes of every lender in this country, that debt is yours. If Brooke stops paying, they come to you. Your credit, your name, your problem, for as long as it lives." $14,000, plus a bridal store card, wearing Wendy's name like a coat that didn't belong to her. "And once you sign the affidavit," Patricia added, more gently, "you cannot unring that bell. The system takes over. It will not care that she's your sister." Wendy said she'd call by Friday. Patricia nodded, and then said the thing Wendy had apparently been waiting 5 years to hear someone say out loud. "They were never going to invite you, Wendy. You're the only person in that entire family who actually reads the signature page." They found out she knew within a day. Ashford had called Brooke to schedule a signature review, credit union language, more or less, for the fire alarm just went off, and the Thompson family emergency broadcast system lit up like a Christmas display. Wendy's phone became a slot machine of guilt. Aunt Sharon, her mother's sister, calling to remind her that weddings only happen once and family is forever. A bridesmaid she'd met exactly twice, texting that she was breaking Brooke's heart over paperwork. And her mother, twice daily, cycling through every station on the dial, weepy, "I don't know what you think you found, baby, but please come home, we'll sort it out as a family," wounded, "after everything I sacrificed raising you girls alone," and, her personal favorite, the one she keeps, "You'll put your own mother in jail over paperwork, what kind of daughter does that? Family helps family, Wendy. Family helps family." That phrase had funded 5 years of her silence. Hearing it redeployed as a legal defense clarified things wonderfully. Then, on Wednesday, a flower arrangement arrived at her office, lilies and roses, a card in Brooke's looping handwriting, "We love you, sis. Please don't destroy my wedding over a misunderstanding." Folded behind the card was a typed page, one paragraph, drafted by someone who had clearly looked up the word for the occasion, a ratification letter, retroactively affirming that Wendy had knowingly authorized the signatures on the Ashford loan. A little yellow arrow sticker, the kind realtors use, pointed cheerfully at the blank signature line at the bottom. They weren't asking for forgiveness. They were asking for her real signature, to bury her forged one underneath it. She put the letter in the folder with everything else. Evidence, she was learning, has a way of hand-delivering itself. Thursday morning, Patricia and Wendy sent a letter of their own, certified mail, return receipt requested, one copy to Diane, one to Brooke, because if there was one language this family had taught her to speak fluently, it was paper. The letter didn't raise its voice. It stated the facts: a loan and a store card existed bearing Wendy's name, she had signed neither. On the date of signing she had been verifiably in Columbus, with a conference badge report and hotel folio enclosed as proof, so no one would mistake this for a bluff. Then it made the offer, which Patricia made Wendy read aloud twice before she'd let her sign it, just to be certain she meant every word. By 9 the following Monday morning, they were to go to Ashford, admit in writing that the signatures were not hers, and formally request her removal from the loan, and close and pay down the bridal card. If they did that, Wendy would sign nothing further and pursue nothing further. If they didn't, that same Monday morning, she would execute the fraud affidavit and file a police report, and the machinery of the system, cold, patient, entirely unbribable, would take over from there. "I'm not threatening them," she told Patricia, signing the cover page. "I'm giving them the only exit that still exists." Patricia told her that was the most accountant sentence she had ever heard in 20 years of practicing law. The green return receipt cards came back a few days later, both signatures ironically genuine. Then, for 3 full days, a first in recorded Thompson family history, silence. On Sunday night, just past 9, her doorbell rang. Through the glass Wendy could see her sister standing alone on the porch, mascara tracked down to her chin, gripping her car keys like a rosary. She stood in the hallway for a moment, deciding. Then she opened the door, because Brooke is her sister. She made tea, because her hands needed something to do. Brooke cried at the kitchen table for a long time, and Wendy has since learned to tell the difference between kinds of crying. This was not remorse. This was the crying of someone watching a plan catch fire, not someone sorry she'd lit the match. The story came out in pieces between tissues. It had been their mother's idea from the start. The wedding budget had quietly collapsed back in winter, the venue kept asking for more, the Whitfields kept gently raising the bar, and Diane knew that if she asked Wendy outright, she'd get a lecture about budgets first and a check second, maybe. But she also knew Wendy would never let a bill go to collections. So her name, tucked quietly behind Brooke's on the paperwork, was, in Diane's own words, just borrowing Wendy's credit, like borrowing her car. She'd have said yes eventually anyway. "You weren't even supposed to find out," Brooke said, and then heard herself say it, and had the decency to look down at the floor. That had been the plan from start to finish. Wendy, uninvited from the wedding her own name was quietly underwriting, kept off every vendor contract and every document, and if it ever surfaced, well, she'd swallow it, the way she always swallowed everything. "You always fix things," Brooke said, reaching for her hand. "Be the bigger person one last time. Please. After the honeymoon we'll refinance somehow, take you off it, I swear. Just sign Mom's letter." Wendy looked at her little sister, asking her to legally ratify her own forgery as a wedding gift. She slid the tissue box a little closer and gave the only answer she had. "The wedding fund is closed, Brooke. So is the bank." At the door, Brooke turned around, eyes suddenly dry, and showed Wendy exactly who she was underneath the mascara. "If this wedding falls apart," she said, "Austin's family is going to blame you." Her mother's answer to the demand letter was not a lawyer. It was a narrative. By Tuesday, a version of events was making its way through the extended family, the church women's circle, and roughly half of Millhaven. Poor Brooke's jealous, bitter, unmarried older sister had stolen the honeymoon fund directly out of the bride's account 2 weeks before the wedding, purely out of spite. Stolen from the bride's account. Diane Thompson is, whatever else she is, a genuinely gifted storyteller, the kind who understands instinctively that you never let a fact slow down a good villain. Wendy's phone filled up with proof of her mother's reach. Aunt Sharon, no longer even bothering to call, just texting scripture, praying for your heart. "Wendy, jealousy is a heavy burden. A bridesmaid, considerably less poetic, everyone knows what you did, you should be ashamed." Word even reached her office. Because Millhaven is a small pond, her office manager heard a version at the pharmacy in which the amount she'd supposedly stolen had grown impressively overnight, the way rumors do when nobody's checking the math. Here's what Wendy did about the smear campaign, and she wants this understood clearly: nothing. She answered no texts. She posted nothing anywhere. She corrected no one at the grocery store. Silence looks like weakness to people who mistake noise for power. But silence, in Wendy's experience, is just an account that hasn't been opened yet. Every accusation went into the folder in her head, dated and filed, sitting quietly beside the affidavit she hadn't signed. Paper doesn't argue. Paper wins, eventually, on its own schedule. Besides, there was only one audience she actually needed to convince, and it wasn't the church circle. 2 days after the flowers arrived, Aunt Carol called. She wanted to hear it directly from Wendy, in person, with her reading glasses on. Carol arrived at the office at closing time, hung her coat on the hook like she'd worked there for years, and sat across the desk with her hands folded. "Diane says you robbed your sister," she said. "I've known your mother for 40 years. So I came to see the books." Wendy didn't argue her case out loud. She'd learned by then that the truth sounds strongest when it isn't performed. She simply slid the folder across the desk and let the paper do the talking. The signature page with handwriting she'd stopped using a decade ago, the photocopy of the expired license from the hall closet, the badge report from Columbus, the hotel folio, the bridal store statement, the ratification letter with its cheerful little yellow arrow. Carol read for 10 full minutes without a single word, the only sounds in the office the turning of pages and the radiator ticking against the cold. Watching her, Wendy thought of her father, the way he used to sit with a parts report until the numbers finally confessed something. Finally Carol closed the folder, took off her glasses, and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "Your father kept books like this," she said quietly. Then she tapped one finger on the forged signature, and something in her expression shifted. "Honey, I've gotten a Christmas card from your mother every year since 1985. I know her handwriting the way I know my own." She turned the page toward Wendy. "Look at the W." Wendy had spent days staring at that signature, comparing it, over and over, to her own hand. Carol was comparing it to Diane's. The impatient little hook at the tail of the final N. The particular slant of the W that showed up nowhere else in Wendy's own signature but everywhere in her mother's grocery lists. Brooke may have filled out the application. But the name itself, Wendy's name, had been signed by the same woman who had taught them both how to write it in the first place. Carol put her glasses back on. "What do you need from me?" Carol became exactly that, a quiet weather front, moving through the family with facts instead of drama, no raised voice, just an aunt with reading glasses and 40 years of memory, correcting the record one phone call at a time. You could feel the temperature in the family group chats shift. Aunt Sharon's scripture text stopped arriving. 2 cousins sent careful, visibly mortified apologies. From Diane's kitchen table, though, nothing. No trip to Ashford. No confession. No paperwork. The deadline Wendy had given them ran out on a gray Monday morning, and the last hours of it brought exactly one more voicemail. Her mother, in full tremolo, "If you do this, you are no daughter of mine, and God sees what you're choosing over family." Wendy listened to it while ironing a blouse. Then she drove to Patricia's office and, with a notary watching, signed the fraud affidavit for Ashford Community Credit Union, every page, every initial. From there she drove straight to the Millhaven Police Department and sat with a patient detective named Reyes, who took her folder, took her statement, and handed her a case number in return. Here's what nobody tells you about that particular moment. People ask if her hand shook, signing a police report against her own mother and sister. It didn't. It was the steadiest signature she had given in 5 years, the first one, she realized, that she'd given entirely for herself. Walking to her car, she thought about her mother's smirk at that kitchen table, the day she'd announced that everyone had agreed. "You are no daughter of mine." She said it out loud once, alone in the parking lot, just to hear how little it actually weighed once it left someone else's mouth. Good to know. The wedding was 5 days out. The machine she'd just switched on had no idea, and would not have cared if it did. An affidavit in a lender's hands moves the way dye moves through a glass of water. You can watch it spread in real time. By Tuesday afternoon, Ashford had frozen the loan entirely. No further disbursement. Automatic payments suspended. The account flagged for fraud review. A certified letter went out to Brooke, requiring her to appear in person with identification to address the cosigner discrepancy. The bridal store card was locked the same day. And because the loan had been quietly drip-feeding the wedding budget all along, the wedding itself began, very quietly and very beautifully, to starve. The caterer in Charleston owed a final installment that no longer had a funding source, called the number on file for the financially responsible party. That number was Wendy's. So did the photographer. So did a string quartet Wendy hadn't even known had been booked, which told her all by itself exactly how far the budget had continued to grow after her official banishment. To each of them she said the same thing, kindly, and confirmed it in writing. The loan behind these bookings was under an active fraud investigation with law enforcement involved. She was not a signer on any of their contracts. They'd want to speak with the bride directly. There was always a small pause on the line, the specific sound of a vendor mentally recalculating their entire week. And that's when the last piece clicked into place for Wendy, sitting at her desk between calls. The banishment had never really been about her energy, or her spreadsheets, or Austin's refined family being unable to tolerate an accountant in the room. Every vendor folder, every payment plan, every screenshot from the group chat had her name buried somewhere in the fine print. A wedding built on her forged credit could survive almost anything, except Wendy actually showing up to read the paperwork. They hadn't banned her because she embarrassed them. They'd banned her because she would have caught them. Wednesday evening, her phone rang with the South Carolina number that had been sitting untouched in her missed calls since the morning after she transferred the money back. Austin. His voice was careful, the voice of an engineer walking into a structure he no longer trusted the load-bearing walls of. The caterer had refused to confirm without payment from a verified source. Brooke had explained, then re-explained, and the two versions hadn't matched. His mother had called the venue directly, and the venue had used words like frozen and investigation. Wendy, he said, I'm going to ask you something, and I'd appreciate the accountant version. What is happening? So she gave him exactly that. No adjectives, no theories, just dates. The loan. The card. The forged signatures, dated to a day she could prove, with documentation, she had spent 2 hours away in Columbus. The affidavit. The case number. She offered to email him copies of everything that was legally hers to share, and he said yes. For a while afterward there was nothing on the line but his breathing and, faintly, a screen door somewhere in Charleston. When he finally spoke again, he sounded a decade older than he had a week earlier. My parents put the rehearsal dinner deposit into that account, he said. Brooke told us your family had a wedding fund. A wedding fund. Wendy let the phrase sit between them with all of its horrible, accidental poetry. Then he said he was sorry, the first person in this entire story to say it plainly, without a clause attached that undid it, and that he needed a day. Thursday night he called again, calmer, his father's voice rumbling somewhere in the background. The Whitfields were requesting a meeting of both families the following evening, at the rehearsal dinner, which was, after all, already paid for and booked. Everyone would be there. My father would like you there too, Austin said, and then, with the first flicker of dry humor she'd ever heard from him, bring the folder. Her mother called an hour later, and Wendy admits she answered on the second ring purely out of curiosity. She wanted to know which mother would show up this time. It was the sweet one. Butter wouldn't melt. Sweetheart, this has all gotten so silly, hasn't it? Come to Charleston tomorrow, talk to the bank people, tell them it was a family misunderstanding. Sign Mom's little letter and all is forgiven. You can even sit up front at the ceremony, right next to me. All is forgiven. 2 weeks earlier, this same woman had smirked across a kitchen table and thrown her out of a wedding she was personally funding. Now the fraud was hers, the investigation was real, the vendors were fleeing one by one, and she was offering Wendy forgiveness plus a good seat, as payment for committing perjury on her own behalf. You have to admire the sheer craftsmanship of it. It takes a lifetime of never once being told no to build confidence that sturdy. I'll be in Charleston tomorrow, Wendy said, and heard her mother exhale in triumph on the other end of the line. I'll be at the dinner Friday. The Whitfields invited me. A pause, tiny, but real. The sound of a woman quietly recounting her cards. Well, Diane said smoothly, recovering. Good. You can fix everything then, in front of everyone. Won't that be nice? She'd already written Friday's script in her head, the prodigal accountant, publicly repenting, signing her own name back into the trap while both families applauded the reconciliation. Wendy told her good night, then booked a flight, refundable, obviously, and packed one small suitcase and one slim leather portfolio, the kind she brings to audits. Into it went the folder. They had set 50 chairs for a rehearsal dinner. They should have set a witness stand. The rehearsal dinner was held at a restaurant on the Charleston waterfront, the kind of place with gas lanterns and a private room that glows like the interior of a wedding magazine. 50 chairs, white linen, low candlelight, a view of masts swaying gently against the harbor. Wendy arrived early and alone, in a gray dress, portfolio under her arm. The first familiar faces she found were Carol and Megan, already seated, having flown in that afternoon on tickets Carol had bought herself. "Your father would want a bookkeeper in the room," Carol said, patting the empty chair beside her. The Whitfield side filled in quietly, handsome and watchful, conversation pitched low in the way people talk near hospital beds. Austin stood by the windows, pale and kind and visibly exhausted. And then came the Thompsons, Brooke in rehearsal dinner white, eyes rimmed pink, and Diane in navy lace, wearing her public face, the gracious matriarch, drifting through the room dispensing little touches on arms like a candidate working a primary. When she reached Wendy, she took both her hands for the room's benefit, squeezed slightly too hard, and said, warmly and clearly enough to be overheard 3 tables away, "I'm so glad you came to make things right, sweetheart." Then she steered Wendy toward a chair placed, Wendy noticed, at the exact center of the room, angled to face the long head table, like a recital seat. "Now," Diane said, settling the room with a hostess's practiced smile. "Wendy's been under a great deal of stress, and there's been a misunderstanding with the bank, and she'd like to clear it all up. Wouldn't you, honey?" 50 faces turned to look at her. Her mother had built the entire stage and cast her in the confession scene. What Diane hadn't accounted for was Mr. Whitfield, Austin's father, silver-haired and entirely unhurried, rising from his seat at the head of the table with a single sheet of paper in one hand. "Actually," he said, "I believe I'll start." Mr. Whitfield spoke the way old Charleston money speaks, softly enough that the whole room instinctively leaned in to hear him. His son, he explained, had shared certain documents with him, and he had a number of questions about the financing of this particular wedding, which his own family had understood, in good faith, to rest on a family fund. He looked directly at Diane when he said the word fund. Her smile held its shape, but you could see, now, the effort it took to keep it there. He invited Wendy, with old-fashioned courtesy, to walk the room through what she knew. So she stood, opened the portfolio, and did the one thing in the world she does best, she presented a file. There was no theatrics in it. Drama, she has always believed, is for people without documents. She laid each page out on the white linen in a neat row as she spoke, turning each one to face the table. A loan at Ashford Community Credit Union, $14,000, opened in March, co-signed under her name. The signature page here, signed using a version of her handwriting that hadn't existed in 10 years. The proof of identity, here, a photocopy of her own expired license, which had spent 5 years sitting in a box in her mother's hall closet. The date of signing, March 14th. Her conference badge report from Columbus, here, showing her scanned into a tax seminar at the very hour of that signing, 2 hours away. The hotel folio. The store card, opened in her name, at a bridal outlet, now locked. The fraud affidavit. The police case number, printed neatly on a detective's business card. "I did not sign this loan," she said, in the same flat, level voice she uses to explain a confusing tax notice to a nervous client. "On the day it was signed, I was in another city. The credit union has frozen it pending a fraud investigation. That is why your caterer hasn't been paid. That's all I came here to say." She sat back down. Nobody moved. The candles hissed faintly. Somewhere down the long table, a piece of ice shifted and collapsed inside a glass, and for one full second it was the loudest sound in the entire city of Charleston. Diane stood up so fast her chair squealed against the floorboards, and the public face, the navy lace, the gracious matriarch, the candidate for hostess of the year, all of it came off at once, like paint under a pressure washer. "How dare you," she said, and then, louder, to the whole room, "How dare she? After everything I have sacrificed, I raised 2 girls practically alone. I gave up everything. And this one with her spreadsheets and her receipts, she has been jealous of her sister since the day that ring went on her finger. She was, in her own terrible way, magnificent, the way a house fire is magnificent. She cried without producing a single tear, gestured toward the ceiling as though appealing to a higher court, invoked Wendy's dead father twice in the space of a minute. The room simply watched her the way you watch weather roll in, silent, wary, waiting to see how bad it would get. Her silence only made her louder, her volume only deepened the silence around it. Then she wheeled on Wendy and jabbed a finger across the linen. "Tell them you signed it. Tell them, Wendy, or God help me. It was your idea." The voice belonged to Brooke. Her sister was on her feet now too, mascara already sliding, one finger pointed straight across the table at their mother. "You said she'd never check. You said Wendy never says no, that she'd cover it like she covers everything. I never wanted to forge anything. You put the license copy in the folder yourself." A collective intake of breath moved through the room like wind through wheat. Diane's face went white, then a furious, mottled pink. For 1 second, exactly one, her hand groped blindly for the back of her chair, and the small photograph of Frank Thompson she'd carried in her wallet for 30 years slipped free and skidded across the floor, face up, staring at all of them. Diane looked down at him. Her hand trembled. For that 1 second, Wendy watched her mother almost become someone else entirely. Then she stepped over the photograph and screamed at Brooke about ingratitude, and the moment closed back over like still water. Wendy stood quietly, walked around the table, and picked her father up off the floor. "You all agreed I wasn't welcome at this wedding," she said, to no one in particular, in no particular hurry. "So why is my name the only thing still holding it up?" Mr. Whitfield rose again, and this time he didn't speak softly for effect, he spoke softly because verdicts, he clearly believed, don't need volume to land. "The Whitfield family," he said, choosing each word like a man laying bricks, "would be withdrawing from tomorrow's ceremony, and from any future ceremony, until every dollar of the wedding had an honest name attached to it." His wife rose beside him without a word. Down the table, Whitfield cousins and aunts stood in 2s and 3s, folding their napkins with an almost unbearable politeness. Austin came around the table to where Brooke stood. "Wendy will give her sister this much." She reached for him with real, unguarded fear, and whatever else she is, that fear was genuine. He took the small white boutonniere pin from his lapel, handed out earlier for a photo none of them would ever use now, and set it gently on the tablecloth between them. In a voice barely above a whisper, but one that carried like a bell through the silent room, he told her he could have lived with a modest wedding. He could not live with a manufactured one. He needed the truth more than he needed Saturday. Then he walked his mother out. Diane made one last grab at the wreckage, the only way she'd ever known how, hands out, tears finally real this time, voice cracking on cue and then cracking for true. "Wendy, baby, fix this. Talk to them. Talk to the bank. You can fix this. Family helps family, Wendy. Please." There it was, one final time, the phrase that had funded the furnace and the transmission and the tuition and 5 years of Wendy's silence, arriving now with its palm turned upward, open, empty. Wendy stepped back out of her reach and kept her voice at the exact register she uses for tax notices, which, it turned out, silenced the room far more effectively than shouting ever could have. "Family helps family. You taught me that." She picked up her portfolio. "So I helped you meet the consequences." Then she walked out of the glowing room, past 50 empty chairs, and closed the door gently behind her. It was somehow louder than a slam. The next 48 hours dismantled the wedding the way a bank forecloses on a house, without malice, exactly on schedule, item by item. The venue, unpaid and now formally unpayable, cancelled Saturday morning and kept the deposit, per contract. Wendy knows because they emailed her. She was, apparently, still the only address on file that reliably answered. The caterer released the date. The string quartet no one had told her about sent a perfectly polite cancellation notice, also, of course, to Wendy. By Sunday, the wedding hadn't been postponed. It simply no longer existed, in the same quiet way a business no longer exists once the sign comes down from the storefront. Ashford's fraud team completed its review within the week. Preliminary finding: signatures not authentic. Cosigner removed from Malone entirely. Store card charged back off Wendy's file completely. The matter referred to the Millhaven Police Department, where Detective Reyes's case number stopped being a formality and became a file with real weight behind it. When Wendy pulled her credit report on schedule, exactly as always, thank you, habit, it came back clean again. Both cuckoo eggs gone from the nest for good. Restitution would come later. But the machine had already done precisely what Patricia promised it would. It did not care, even slightly, that Brooke was her sister. On Sunday afternoon, standing in the security line at the Charleston airport, her phone buzzed once. Austin. He'd learned Ashford's official finding through his own bank that morning. The message was short, the way honest things tend to be. He thanked her for the accountant version of events, said his parents sent their respect to the sister with the folder, and told her he'd returned the ring to the jeweler for exactly what he'd paid for it. She read it twice, standing in her socks on the cold airport floor, and typed back the only reply that has ever fit every occasion in this entire story. Good to know. Here's how it all settled, because she knows you want the receipts, and she respects that about you. The district attorney's office reviewed the file that fall. Wendy told them the plain truth and also told them she wasn't seeking prison time for anyone. With a first offense on record and full restitution offered, the case resolved the way these family matters usually do. Brooke formally accepted responsibility for the application, and a restitution agreement now takes a fixed bite out of her paycheck every single month: the loan, the store card, the vendors left holding the bag. She works a second job on weekends at, of all places on this earth, a bridal outlet. Diane was never charged. The application had been filled out in Brooke's name and Brooke's handwriting, and the only witness who could have placed the forged co-signature in Diane's own hand was Brooke, and Brooke, in the end, would not testify against her mother. But Millhaven is a small pond, and the churchwomen's circle quietly rotated Diane out of the treasurer's seat she'd held for 11 consecutive years, and nobody ever had to explain exactly why. The week after Charleston, Wendy drove to her mother's house with Carol beside her as a witness, and took the fireproof box back out of the hall closet. Every birth certificate, every old license, every piece of paper wearing her name now lives in the safe at her office. She still sees her mother at funerals and at Christmas. Hello and goodbye. A card with no check tucked inside it. Diane tells anyone who'll still listen that Wendy destroyed Brooke's wedding. Fewer people listen than she thinks. Carol and Megan have dinner with Wendy the first Friday of every month, and they do not talk about the wedding, and it is, every single time, wonderful. The number, by the way, 5 years, every dollar of it, down to the penny, was $41,000. The bank is closed. 6 months after Charleston, a hand-addressed envelope showed up at Wendy's office. Brooke, an actual letter this time, pen on paper, and inside it, for the first time in this entire story, the words "I'm sorry," standing alone at the end of a sentence with nothing trailing after them, no but dragging behind like a getaway car waiting at the curb. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for anything at all, which is precisely how Wendy knew some small, genuine thing in her had actually shifted. Wendy read it twice at her desk, then wrote back one line and mailed it that same afternoon: "My door isn't locked, but the bank is closed for good." They've had coffee twice since. It's careful. It's slow. It might, eventually, become something real again. And either way, her name, finally, stays hers. Her mother still tells her version of the story to whoever remains willing to hear it. Let her. She once told Wendy she wasn't welcome. And honestly, in a way she never intended, she turned out to be right about one small thing. The version of Wendy they'd been happy to invite to family gatherings for 5 years, the quiet one, the one with the open checkbook and the closed mouth, doesn't exist anymore. She wrote her off the books herself. If 5 years of paying for love taught her anything, it's this: The people who've come to treat you like a bank will always call your first boundary a robbery. Set it anyway.